Hi, everyone. Mac Pierre here, and welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast. Thanks for joining us. I'm Mac Pierre, attorney, mediator, and arbitrator based in Houston, Texas, and working throughout Texas and Florida.
And I am Natalia Olowska Pierre, advocate, mediator, and arbitrator based in Warsaw, but admitted to practice family law mediation in Florida.
And I'm Daniel Rainey. I'm in the Washington, D.C. area, and my practice is basically education, training, and system design these days, although I've done mediation for many years.
In this series with Dan Rainey, who kindly joined us the second time, we are talking about communication skills, where Dan is actually a lecturing professor and a well-known, worldwide known expert. So taking advantage of his fantastic skills and communication skills in particular, we want to talk today about listening effectively online with more tips for mediators. Having said that, I would like to welcome Dan to reflect on how it is and how it works to be listened to and listen yourself.
Mac, were you going to say something as we started?
So basically, the topic is one that's very interesting to all of us, and that is listening is a very, very crucial point in mediation, arbitration, or just in everyday life, right? Too many of us don't listen enough. We have 2 ears, 1 mouth, but unfortunately, we do more talking than listening sometimes. But for a mediator, the skill of listening is something that, if you haven't mastered it, can ruin mediations because it doesn't help parties come to the point where communication and information is facilitated from one speaker to the other. And so we wanted to have this talk with you because we wanted to just spread a little bit more information about the importance of listening and how to do it effectively. Now, the first question was, how do you listen generally in mediation as opposed to listening in any other setting?
Well, I think to some degree, there's really not a lot of difference in listening in mediation and meeting and listening in other formats, except that as the third party, you have a responsibility to not only listen well yourself, but also to monitor the way the other parties are listening to each other. And I can tell you that I've run into some situations where there was obviously a breakdown in listening. I remember one mediation that I did several years ago, and one of the parties was a supervisor and an employee. And the supervisor said, after I asked the question, why are we here and what's the issue that you see? And as part of what she said, well, the person who's here, this guy is a valuable employee. He really does good work, and I really want to work this out because I'm really sorry we ever got into this situation in the first place. And I turned to the other party, the employee who was sitting there, and I said, what do you think about that? And he said one sentence. He said, well, she wants to fire me. And I said, okay, let's try this again. Didn't I hear you say that he's a valuable employee and you want to work this out? Yes, absolutely. That's what I said. And that's what I meant. What do you think about that? She wants to fire me. We had to go through this several times before he finally acknowledged that, well, maybe she really doesn't want to fire me. Maybe we really do have something to talk about. Now, it's not that someone who doesn't listen well is dumb. It's not that they're being intentionally obstructive. It's that we all carry around with us a set of filters that help us, in some senses, frame what we're going to say, but it also helps us frame how we hear what we have heard someone else say. We have this, when we draw a basic communication model, we have this notion that there's a sender and a receiver. And that's somewhat misleading because we are all sending and receiving all of the time, anytime we sit down and have a conversation. And so we have to be aware of the message we're giving, but also we have to be aware of how we're interpreting the message coming from the other side. And, classically, as everybody knows, active listening involves 3 components. One is paying attention and actually listening. The second is being able to, in your own mind, paraphrase and process what you hear so that you think you know what you've heard. And the third step is to be able to enunciate back to the person who's talking to you what they've said in a way that's acceptable to them so that you get understanding, which is really what communication and what mediation is all about. we don't always, well, we do always strive to get resolution, but we don't always get there. But what we always strive to get and really want to get is understanding. And so if we decide to walk away from the mediation without a deal, we want to know exactly why we're walking away. We want to understand the other party's point of view and understand where they're coming from. And that comes out of being able to listen well and to make sense out of the things that you hear. So the thing that differentiates mediation from listening in an ordinary conversation is the fact that we must take advantage of the opportunity to hear both sides, process both sides, and then manage the conversation in a way that encourages active listening with people who probably are not in a mood to listen actively. Because, as I've often said, we don't get people on their best day. We get them when they're in conflict. And so they're probably not going to be automatically attuned to listening well to the other party. So we need to, as third parties, we need to do things that we can work with them on to help them listen better.
Thank you so much for that. When I think about listening in mediation, I do think about creating a space for participants where they can be listened to. And I want to ask you, Dan, but also want Mark to reflect on it if possible. What do we listen with? Is it only our ears? And how do we show other people that they are listened to?
Well, we don't just listen with our ears, we listen with our eyes as well. And there are, in my mind, there are three elements to the communication channels we choose when we use technology. There is the verbal channel, that is what you say, the words that you use, the language that you use, the grammar and the syntax of the language that you use. So when I say a sentence to you, it means something grammatically and syntactically. There is a nonverbal element, and that is the things that you pick up from my tone of voice, from my intonations, from the way I'm dressed, from what I look like, from all of the other nonverbal cues that we use to interpret what's being said. And then there's also what I would call the environmental element. That is, where are we? What are we doing? What is the thing that's around us? What situation are we in? Now, all of those things, all three of those elements of the channel that we choose must come through our personal filters and are affected by our personal filters. And so when I enter let's talk about a face-to-face environment, when I enter a formal conference room, in a law office with law books on the walls and a huge oak table and leather chairs and the whole 9 yards, and everybody's in suits and ties or dressed really well, and there's a very solemn attitude, that environment encourages us to be a little quiet and to listen. If I'm sitting at home in my den with a glass of wine just out of sight of the camera, talking to you in a mediation, that's a whole other environment. It may not encourage the same kind of attention or the same kind of filtering that would be encouraged if I were in another environment. Online, as we've talked about before, I can see some of your nonverbal if we're using video, but I can't see all of it. And so the nonverbal becomes somewhat attenuated by the fact that we're using this channel. If I'm talking to you using audio only on the telephone, then we've attenuated even more. If I talk to you using text over an asynchronous platform, I've attenuated even more. And so I'm losing that information that we would be listening to if we were face-to-face and we had a full environment to operate with. So what happens when you're operating in a mediation situation online is you have to remember that there are two sets of things at work. One is the channel itself and the limitations or the impact of the elements of that channel, period, no matter what the situation is. The other thing is the notion that we are now somehow removed from one another in a way that we wouldn't be if we were sitting across the table from each other. So there's the channel, but the other thing that we have to remember is that the set of filters that we have are going to be very powerful. And so my background, my age, my education, my biases, my perceptions of you, my feelings about the situation that we're in, my point of view and my proposal that I bring to the table initially, all of those things are going to filter for me the things that I'll say and how I'll say them, and they're going to filter for me how I take what you say. So it's a wonder, given all of that we ever communicate well at all. And one of the ways that we do manage to communicate well is to engage in some kind of active listening process, which is what the mediator needs to encourage as part of the system.
Yeah. So that active listening is what's so crucial. And these days I've noticed a lot of people have smartwatches, right? And I used to have a smartwatch, and I'd always be looking at it. I remember finding myself while someone's talking to me, looking at me in the face, speaking with me about a topic, I would find myself veering my eyes over to look at my watch. Well, I wasn't checking the time because that might send a message to the person who's speaking. I was checking a message because my watch vibrated around my wrist. Maybe it was a text message that came through or an email that came through. And I remember thinking, that might be coming across as kind of rude to the person who's speaking because of what they think that I'm doing. I must be disregarding them because oh my goodness, look at the time. What am I doing here? This person is just wasting my time. So this caused me, when I realized it, to stop with the smartwatches. Right now, I have my little Amazon Halo band that has no screen, no indicators, nothing. It doesn't buzz, so I have to go to my phone to see its notifications. But that was a fix, I guess, when it came to me making sure that I'm going to listen actively, because I cannot control how often I'm going to want to veer off and look at my smartwatch when I'm supposed to be, giving total eye contact to the person who is speaking. So just something small, right? But many of us have these things that we don't even realize that we do when we should be dedicating active listening to the person who's speaking.
Well, that's a great observation, because the first step in listening well is actually being able to concentrate on what's being said. And it's hard enough to do that when you're sitting across the table from somebody. I mean, your example is a great example. You check your watch, or you have your computer open in front of you, or there's the windows over there and you're looking out the window, or whatever. Any of those things are going to be interpreted by the people who are on the other side of the table. One of the things that I tell people about working online is that you have to make the technology as invisible as possible in order for you to have a good communication. It is almost like a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, says that if you notice the technology, it's like noticing the lighting in a play. You're not supposed to notice the lighting, you're supposed to notice the play. So what we want in terms of preparation for third parties, if you're going to be a really good listener as a mediator online, I think the very first thing you have to do has nothing to do with what the parties are going to say to you. It has to do with how comfortable you are dealing with the technology that you're trying to manage as part of that process. So if I'm using a platform that I'm not familiar with, and I'm having to think about, what button do I push next, or how do I organize this, or how do I do that, or how do I keep this from happening? If that's at the front of your mind all the time, you are not going to be listening very well to the people and what they're saying. And so this idea to me that you can sort of pick and choose technology and it doesn't really matter as long as it's getting your voice across is crazy, right? What you pick and how you interact with that technology that you pick is a huge part of whether you can listen well as a third party. And which is why I tell people, drive your family crazy. If you're going to use Zoom, or you're going to use Troct, or you're going to use whatever, use it, with your family. Tell them, I need you to come on and spend an hour online with me so I can learn how to do this stuff. Use it enough, pardon me, use it enough outside the messages that the parties are trying to send to each other, so that you're very comfortable with it and you don't really have to think about the technology, because the more you think about the technology, the less you're paying attention to what's being said. And that takes away from your ability to function well as a mediator. So that for me is the first thing. It's how do I pay attention? And there are all the things that are normally there, the watch, for example, but you just add to that this idea of how am I managing the technology? And there are some people I know who do online work who have they've approached this problem by saying, I'm going to have another person handle the technology so that I don't have to worry about it at all. All I have to do is listen to the parties themselves. That's an extreme way to do it. You can also become competent enough yourself that you can handle the technology without having to think about it too much. But one way or another, you need to make that channel as transparent to you as possible, because until you do that, at least part of your mind is not going to be on what's going on the table. And that's a real problem in terms of active listening.
Thank you so much. And tell us, please, because we've just covered how it is that the mediation needs to listen. We know that technology shouldn't be the problem. We know that we have to listen with our eyes and our ears. We know that we need to make sure that we are understood. But what comes to my mind when I also think about listening in mediation is how to make others listen to us. Again, about listening, but about other people taking part in mediation, wanting to listen to us. What would you say about it?
Well, I think, again, one of your duties as a third party, I mean, one of the things they're paying you to do, like why you're there in the first place, is to manage that conversation so that you get some understanding between the parties. Right? That's your reason for being there in the first place. So how do you do that? Well, I think the first part of active listening is paying attention. I talked about that. The second part of active listening is actually taking in the message and interpreting it for yourself. And so you can do that internally without saying anything at all. You can also do that by saying out loud what you think you've heard. Now, we do this anyway in face-to-face communication, but I think it's more important to do it online than it is face-to-face, because I think frankly, there's more opportunity for misunderstanding operating online than there is operating face-to-face. And so if Mac, does a 5-minute rant about something, and he's, I'm the mediator, one of the things that I want to do before anything else happens is I want to unpack that rant. I want to unpack that set of things that he's just said and try to frame it in a way that is going to get through the filter that the other party has probably put up. And so partially it's for me and partially it's for the parties when I will say out loud, okay, Mac, what I think I heard you say was, did I get that right? And if I didn't, correct me here. And so before the other party has a chance to respond at all, I want to go back and forth with Mac and say, let's make sure that just for my purpose only, just so that I understand, can you explain to me, is this what you meant? And as I'm doing that, the other party is hearing this message over and over again. They're filtering it, and they're getting not only what Mac has said, they're getting my version of it, and they're getting his assent or his correction. So that when I turn to them and say, okay, what do you think about that? Did you hear the same thing I heard, and how are we going to proceed? They're not just getting one message that has been filtered by Mac's choice of words and their choice of how they interpret those words. They're getting a package of information that has been delivered, discussed, verified, and then passed on. And so I think, frankly, that you should take more time in that second step of active listening, in taking it in, trying to understand what it means, and then verifying what it means. You take more time with that online than you would if you were face-to-face. And I think it's extremely important to do that if you're talking, for example, in a text environment, because very often people will not, if they're talking, they will say probably more than they need to say. If they're writing, they'll say less than they need to say. So if you're dealing with your third parties and you're doing it online in a text environment, you want to go overboard and say, okay, this is what I think you said, and you're going to write out more than they wrote out and say, is this what you really meant? If it's not, let's get it right. It also means that you have the opportunity, if you're using text in an asynchronous environment particularly, to be a gatekeeper as opposed to simply a moderator. So if the two of you are having a mediation, and it's a really contentious issue, I can say, okay, Mac, tell me, write down what you think, write your opening narrative for me, and let me see what you're going to say. And Natalia's not ever going to see it until we're both satisfied that it's how you want to say it. So you and I go back and forth for a while. We frame that in a way that says everything you want to say. I can ask you the question, how do you think she's going to interpret that? Is that what you want? You want to live with that? I can go through all of that information with you and then finally pass it along to Natalia. So what she gets is our best shot at actually communicating what you want to communicate. And then I can deal with her the same way. And if her impulse is to go back and say 2 words, up yours, then I can say, well, do you really want to say that? I mean, what do you think the reaction is going to be? Is there another way? I understand you're upset. Is there a way we can communicate your upsetness in a way that isn't going to alienate the conversation? So you have some opportunities working online that you don't necessarily have if you're working face-to-face. But the bottom line on all of it is that second step is important. I want to take in what you're saying, actively listen to it, take in what you say, then try to paraphrase it back, try to put it in context and say, okay, let's make sure that the meaning you intend to get across is the meaning that's actually getting there. So that's the second step.
Gotcha. Thank you. So we've reached about 20 minutes. So I just wanted to segue towards closing. Just wanted to get some thoughts from you on listening by the actual mediation parties. Okay, because we've been focusing mainly on, I guess, helping educate mediators to be good listeners and to help move the mediation along. But also we need to help the parties be good listeners as well, so that they can contribute to the mediation actually being resolved. So you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I do actually. I mean, there are some mediation situations where you, as the third party, serve almost as the intermediary, as the voice of both parties. I mean, in the extreme case, for example, in a lot of employment law mediation, the parties are actually in different rooms, and you're doing shuttle diplomacy between the two. And so, in those situations, there's a heavy reliance on you. But in a situation where the parties are together, either in a virtual room online or in an actual room together, my approach to third-party work, and it's just a matter of style, is that as long as I sense that they're actually hearing each other across the table, I will keep my mouth shut. I think my role generally is, if I hear something that sounds like a misunderstanding, if I hear something that sounds like it's a barrier to communication, if I hear something that's going to be a problem, I want to step in and use that active listening skill to say, well, I thought I heard you say this, but now it seems that we're hearing this. Let's go back and clarify this. And so I'll step in if I hear what is obviously a miscommunication. I think the other thing that I would do much more aggressively in an online situation than I would in a face-to-face situation is the final wrap-up, the final statement of what our agreement is. When I was doing a lot of contract negotiation, I would actually come up with an example. I would say, okay, these are the contract provisions we've just agreed on. Okay, so if I'm an employee working under this contract and I do this, this is going to happen to me. Is that correct? And I would run through a couple of scenarios, and so that both parties would be able to say, yeah, that's what we meant. Or if there was a glitch, we could say, oh, well, okay, we didn't think about that. Let's go back and fix that. So I think you have to be much more aggressive in the end to make sure that you've actually got agreement, that you've actually got understanding on both sides. It's, I've said many times that the problems that you face online are the same problems that you face offline. It's just that you have to take extra steps to make sure that the problems that you're facing are taken care of and are handled in an efficient way, as opposed to being able to sit back more in a face-to-face environment.
And thank you so much for that, reaching almost 24 minutes and sharing the wisdom with you and taking advantage of everything you know and you've experienced in your vast practice. We would like to thank you a lot and thank our listeners, viewers, for being with us today and for wanting to know more about listening, active listening, and listening online. If you want to watch this piece again, please visit instantmediations.com or Instant Mediations app. If you want to contact our speaker, you have the details on the screen. And apart from that, it was great to have you, and I hope to see you soon. Please remember that nothing contained in our series constitutes legal advice. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.